Now, interestingly, no social institution can exist without a narrative. So even though Gert says, hey, there is no larger purpose to education, we need to come together and find one, that's not necessarily true. Education has a very clear narrative it's working on now. It's just one that most of us wouldn't have selected. So what is the narrative, the function driving education today? Hello everybody, and welcome to this week's From Theory to Practice, where I take a look at the research so you don't have to. Now, as you know, we're taking a journey through my new book, 10 Things Schools Get Wrong and How We Can Get Them Right. And this week we're going to take a look at the last chapter, Chapter 10, Purpose, the Problem with Narrative. Now, as you can guess, this is a pretty deep theoretical chapter. So the article I've selected that aligns with this is called Good Education in an Age of Measurement by Gert Biesta. Now, to understand this paper, we have to differentiate between form and function. Now, form is pretty simple. It's what we do or how we do something. Function, on the other hand, is why we do something. What is the ultimate purpose or outcome we are hoping to achieve? So a great way to understand form and function is simply just look at architecture. Every piece of architecture has its form, the construction itself, what materials we use, how is it built, awesome. But every piece of architecture also has its function. How are people going to use this structure? Now, in this paper, Gert makes a very good case that education is largely focused on form. A lot of our discussions and debate have to do with what are we going to do, how are we going to do it, and what he calls the efficacy of teaching. Are kids learning? How fast are they learning? How much are they learning? Cool. What most of these discussions lack is a deference to function. We ask how are kids learning, but very rarely do we ask what are they learning for? What aims are we hoping to achieve? In the end, it's not a question of means, it's a question of ends. As this paper rightly points out, there's been a major focus on measurement in education, on quantification. And unfortunately, what seems to have happened is, rather than having a clear function and then using measurement to determine whether or not we're hitting that function, the measurement itself has become the function, and we've decided to start to value that. Only things that are quantifiable, measurable, used on a standardized test become meaningful. So if we want to realign our values, refocus, redevelop a purpose, a function for education, what does that function need to have? And in this paper, Gert outlines three things. So in order for an idea to be a viable function of education, it must meet what's called, first, the qualification standard. Ultimately, this is a question of curriculum. What ideas and skills are worth teaching kids, and how is it best to frame these ideas? The next is what's called a socialization structure. Here's where we recognize that education is by and large meant to help individuals thrive in a society. So what is that society? What are the groups that already exist, and how do we make that smooth transition from education to living within this larger social sphere that already exists? And the third is this subjectification element. Yes, it's well and good to train kids to live in a society, but we also have to train them to live independently, to push beyond that society, to have the means to change that society. So we've got qualification, what are we going to teach, how are we organizing the world? Socialization, what is the broader society we're meant to be a part of? And subjectification, how do we allow people to develop a personal identity as well? And the last thing Gert says in this paper is that these three elements can't live in isolation. In fact, they're best to think of kind of like a Venn diagram. An effective function can't be one or two of these. It's that intersection spot where all three of them come together. And this spot here is what I call narrative with a capital N. Once you align the world with society, with individual, you now have your function for education, and this is what everything is going to push towards. Now, interestingly, no social institution can exist without a narrative. So even though Gert says, hey, there is no larger purpose to education, we need to come together and find one, that's not necessarily true. Education has a very clear narrative it's working on now. It's just one that most of us wouldn't have selected. So what is the narrative, the function driving education today? We call this narrative the economic consumers, and it has two tenets. Tenet 1, you are what you do for a living, and tenet 2, worth is measured according to the goods you possess. Now, this might sound like I'm being bitter, but I'm totally not. Think about it. This is actually a very powerful narrative. Quantification. If economics is everything, then those facts and skills we're teaching students need to be those facts and skills which ensure they have the best chance of getting a job and joining the economy in the future. This is the exact purpose of 21st century skills, of job readiness programs, of immersion learning. We are teaching kids how to get a job. Identity. If everything is economics, then self-worth becomes tied up with human capital. What are those skills or abilities you have that make you more suited for higher paying jobs, and a higher salary equates to a good life? In socialization, if everything is economics, then we become economic units, and your social duty becomes to spend money so other social members can become economic units, and a country's identity ultimately becomes its economic identity. So now let's bring this back to us. What does this mean for us as teachers? Well, there's really only one big take home here, and it's this. What is our function? What is our reason? The outside economic consumer narrative is taking precedence in schools. It's not enough for us to say we don't like this narrative, we want to accomplish other things. We have to develop a very clear narrative on the purpose of school, because only when we have an effective capital N narrative that meets all three aspects of this model can we effectively begin to push back against the current narrative and start to rewrite what the ultimate function of school is. You can't fight a narrative with an idea, with a dream, with a hope. You can only fight a narrative with a counter narrative. So what other counter narratives might be out there that align more with what most teachers desire? Well, that's what we take a look at in chapter 10 of this book. We see what are some other narratives, what impact might they have, and how can they be used to push back against the current system. So as I said, a very big philosophical chapter, but probably my favorite chapter in the book. This is the one that really allows us to step into our own power, take agency again over our profession, and start to say, here's what we do, here's why we do it. So thank you so much for taking this journey through this book with me. I had a great time, and I hope you all learned a little something. If you're interested in reading it, it's available online, Amazon, any of those booksellers online. Otherwise, we've hit the end of the book, which means from here on out, we're going to return to our normally scheduled programming, back to a more traditional From Theory to Practice.